In 2007, 13 years after the murders, a publisher made a deal with O.J. Simpson to write a book. It was a hypothetical confession to the murders of Ron and Nicole. The book was called If I Did It. Pablo Fenves, who you'll meet in just a bit, was the ghostwriter of this book. Now, most people believe this pseudo-confession is in fact as close to an actual confession as we'll ever hear. The book has a friend called Charlie who drops by Simpson's house at Rockingham shortly before the murders and accompanies Simpson to Nicole's place. Here's Simpson in an interview talking about the events of June 12, 1994.
This is very difficult for me to do this. Very difficult for me because it's hypothetical. This guy, Charlie, shows up, the guy who I'd recently become friends with. I don't know why he had been by Nicole's house, but it told me you wouldn't believe what's going on over there. And I remember thinking, well, whatever's going on over there has got to stop.
So this Charlie had been giving Simpson some bad news about Nicole, her partying, the company she was keeping, and got Simpson all riled up.
We get in the Bronco and go over. In the hypothetical, I put on a cap and gloves.
Simpson goes on to explain where the knife came from.
I always kept a knife in the car for the crazies and stuff because you can't travel with a gun. And I remember Charlie saying, you ain't bringing that. And I didn't, right? But I believe he took it in the book. I go to the front and I'm looking to see what's going on. And I can see that it appears like Nicole had candles all the time. And music was on, and while I was there, a guy shows up.
Presumably, this is when Ron Goldman is coming to drop off the glasses to Nicole to help her out.
Nicole had come out, and we started having words about who is this guy, why is he here, what's going on. And I think Charlie had followed this guy in, wanted to make sure there was no problem, and he brought the knife. As things got heated, I just remember Nicole fell and hurt herself. And this guy kind of got into a karate thing. And I said, well, you think you can kick my ass? And I remember I grabbed a knife. I do remember that portion, taking a knife from Charlie. And to be honest, after that, I don't remember. Except I'm standing there and there's all kind of blood and stuff around.
Nicole fell and hurt herself? He leaves out the part where she's stabbed 12 times and nearly decapitated. He mentions that Ron assumed a karate stance, but leaves out stabbing him 22 times, then laughs while reminding us that this is hypothetical.
I hate to say this, but this is hypothetical. I know we got to back up again.
This is Confronting O.J. Simpson. I'm your host, Kim Goldman.
After the criminal trial, there were a couple of key things that kept this story in the spotlight. One was the If I Did It book. The other was the civil trial where Simpson was sued for the wrongful deaths of Ron and Nicole. Now, we'll tell you more about the book later when Kim talks with writer Pablo Fenves. First, the Goldmans recall their second attempt to get justice for Ron.
A year plus later, after we went through the 9 months of trial and he was acquitted, you and I filed a civil suit, a wrongful death suit. Why was that important to you that we file the civil suit? Because nobody knew what that was at that time.
I didn't know anything about civil suits. In my mind, it became the opportunity, a second go-round to get some justice for Ron.
The first time for me that it felt really powerful was when it was on the paperwork that it said you were suing him, that it was you versus him.
For me, that was powerful.
Yeah.
It was me against him.
Was it important for you to have it on the record that 12 people thought that he was responsible for killing Ron and Nicole?
Yeah. He was going to be punished in some way. He wasn't punished in any way in the criminal trial. And the civil trial gave us an opportunity to have him, quote unquote, punished. I remember at some point in the process of filing, you were asked if you wanted to attach a dollar amount.
We were condemned for doing that. Well, now you're just kind of trying to get after this guy.
Right.
You just want money.
There wasn't any amount of money that was great enough to equal the value of Ron's life. If the punishment in the civil trial had been trillions of dollars, it wouldn't have been equal to what Ron was worth.
Our attorneys, Dan Petruccelli and his team, had to put on testimony about the value of Ron's life, what he meant to the family. They had to address loss of wages.
I remember a particular day, his attorney for the civil trial was a guy named Baker. He made some comment about Ron, that it was no big deal,
Right.
that he was murdered. He was only a waiter.
He was just a waiter.
And I went, in a brief millisecond, I was nuts. And I said something, because I was sitting right next to Dan, and Dan reached over and kind of tapped the side of my leg and said, "Don't say anything, I'll take care of it." Dan got up and walked over to Baker's table and reached into his pocket and slammed a bunch of money down on the table and yelled at Baker and said, "What's your son worth?" And Baker just looked at him and didn't answer, and he yelled at him again, "What's your son worth? Answer me." He never answered, of course. "How dare you say anything about Ron's value?" And the look on the judge's face was this small grin of, you got even with him.
In the criminal case, we had no voice. We had no authority. We had no
ability to control anything.
The shift for the civil case was we were running the ship. We picked our attorneys. We made it very clear when we sat down with Dan what we wanted, what our expectations were, and what our role was going to be. And he very much embraced yours and my involvement.
I remember in our first interview with Dan, there was a connection because he seemed to appreciate and understand where we were coming from and what our need was.
Hello.
Dan.
Hey, Kim. It's great to hear your voice.
Thank you. You too. You sounded exactly the same.
Sound the same. Hair is entirely gray.
The civil case is obviously super important to me, and you were the most important part of all of that.
You know, this whole experience, Kim, is etched in my memory. I remember watching the verdict come down and the criminal case and feeling empty in the pit of my stomach that this guy had gotten away with murder. I've been practicing law for 40 years and I've had extraordinary cases, but this was not a case. This was just a change of life for me. And never in a million years did I imagine within maybe a week I would be sitting in your living room.
I remember I was living at my dad's house in Agora, and we had been interviewing attorneys, some unsavory, and then you walked in, and I remember feeling I immediately liked you.
You know, we all connected, and the rest is history, as they say.
Will you explain, just in layman's term, the difference between the civil system and the criminal system?
The civil justice system presents a far more pure search for the truth. Because a criminal case is a determination of whether the government can strip someone of their life or liberty by proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And the government has lots of restrictions. They can't call the defendant to the witness stand, for example.
Right.
All of that is different in the civil case, where there's a fulsome discovery process designed to get all of the facts and evidence out on the table. And the burden of proof is different, where the plaintiff only has to prove the case by a preponderance of evidence, which means it's more likely than not.
Right.
But beyond that, the plaintiff can call the defendant to the witness stand.
Right.
The defendant takes the fifth or fails to testify. The defendant loses by default. And one of the big questions in our case was whether he was going to show up for his deposition or take a default. If he had taken the default, he would have been found liable for the murders. But, given his ego,
Right.
his arrogance, and his belief that, he could talk his way out of this, he showed up for the deposition. That turned into 14 days of deposition.
Do you remember your first meeting, that first day that he came?
I do. Yeah, and I remember that he extended his hand, and I shook it, and I immediately felt awful about doing it. And I felt like, wow, I just got seduced in that moment.
Yeah.
Just like all the other people around him. And it was a real object lesson about the need to stand up to him.
Did you benefit from seeing what the prosecutors missed in the criminal case?
I mean, one of the things that prosecutors did not do a good job of was dig out all of the domestic violence evidence there was. Marcia Clark and Chris Darden made a mistake in focusing on domestic violence as a social topic, as opposed to telling the story about what happened in this relationship. We found other witnesses, and we found witnesses that they interviewed who they didn't get the full story from, who came forward and testified about Simpson hitting Nicole in different public places. But more importantly, we developed the whole story about the relationship, how it spiraled in those last months, weeks, and days, and really built that whole timeline out. Because jurors decide cases essentially based on the story of the case. This is really a murder case in a civil courtroom. So let me tell you what happened, ladies and gentlemen. And you start from the beginning and you go to the end. And it didn't come out that way in the criminal case.
We also got the gift of the picture of him wearing the Bruno Magli shoes. And it was in the Buffalo Bills newsletter like 8 months prior or something.
We had ticket stubs. We had the original negatives. They tried to say the picture was doctored. And that was even before the days of Photoshop. But those pictures were sort of symbolic in many ways of how he had lied his way through this whole ordeal.
I remember you put up a board.
Liar's board. I had a big board where I listed all the lies he had told. I couldn't have listed all of them because it would have taken multiple boards. So I had to do all the big lies.
Right.
An innocent man would not lie about the murder of the mother of his children.
That's the big difference between this trial and the criminal trial. They have O.J. Simpson's own words to compare all of the evidence to. And so Dan Petrocelli, in effect, can say, look, forget about all of the issues that are in controversy. Think about the fact that O.J. Simpson is wearing the same gloves as the killer in a picture a year before the killings. Think about the fact that O.J. Simpson is wearing the same shoes as the killer in a picture a year before the killings. Think about the fact that O.J. Simpson coincidentally cut his finger on the same night at the same time that his wife was killed. Think about the fact that Nicole Brown Simpson put in her safety deposit box pictures of her beaten face with this letter that she had written describing some of the beatings. Think about all of that before you even think about all of the blood evidence in the Bronco at his home, at the crime scene. It's a very powerful argument for the plaintiffs to make.
I have fallen in love with this cool new game called Best Fiends. It's a 5-star rated mobile puzzle game, and I have worked my way up. It's been about a week since I've checked in with you, and you'll never guess. I am already up to level 107. I know, it's crazy. I can do it, though. I'm going to keep going. It's this really fun game where all these cute little characters and bright lights and these fun puzzles. It gives me just tons of game time, and I can just sit and play with it when I'm waiting for my kid, or if I just need to shut out the world, I can just focus on all these puzzles. It's super casual. I can play by myself or even with my kid. Okay, so here's what I'm asking you to do. I want you to download the free 5-star rated mobile puzzle game on the Apple App Store or in Google Play. If you just search for Best Fiends, that's friends without the R, and you too can solve thousands of fun puzzles and collect tons of cute characters. So again, go to the Apple App Store or Google Play and search for Best Fiends, that's friends without the R. Something that has always bothered me is that people say that because the preponderance of the evidence is different, people have accused us of like, well, it's just civil, who cares? You know, you didn't have to prove as much. People don't want to accept the verdict that we got in the civil case because they think it's less than. And I think I've always taken issue with that.
Oh, that's just ignorance. Sheer ignorance, because the civil case actually establishes the real facts of the case. And it was far more comprehensive and far more dramatic. And more importantly, this was the victim's family's case.
Right.
They were the plaintiffs, not the state of California, not Marcia Clark and Chris Darden and all those people who became more important than the actual victims. Your dad testified. Nicole's mom testified. And your dad's testimony for me was by far the most powerful part of the trial.
Yeah.
And asked him, about how much he missed Ron and loved him. And he started crying, and I started crying, and the jury started crying. Then the other thing I pointed out is Simpson was attacking Ron. I argued to the jury that was perhaps the most powerful evidence of Simpson's guilt, because Ron was trying to save Nicole's life.
Right.
So Ron died trying to save the wife of, ex-wife of OJ, the mother of his children. He should be eternally grateful. He could never act truly innocent. Everything he did projected his guilt. It was an extraordinary experience because while you guys were in the same courtroom in the criminal case, you were with marshals.
Right.
He was incarcerated. But now he was free, and you guys were going to be in the same courtroom together.
We had an incident inside the courtroom. I don't know if you remember. At the end of the court day, I was watching him walk out, and then he was staring back at me. And the killer's like, she's looking at me. She's staring at me. And then my dad turned around and thought that the killer was giving my dad dirty looks. And so then my dad started screaming. Do you remember this?
I think he wanted no part of your dad, I'll tell you, It's hard for people to understand the raw and intense emotions. To be in the same room, to be like eating the same food.
Yeah.
It was unthinkable, right?
Yeah. We had to make sure we weren't coming in and out of the door together, like that the hallways were clear.
And, one time your dad and I ended up in the restroom. There was only one men's room around the corner from the courtroom, and we would try to obviously use it when he was not, and vice versa. And then one time we didn't think he was in there. We went in there, and there he was. And, he tried to smirk at us, and we just turned around and walked out. I had to push your dad out of there fast before he said something.
In hindsight, you were saddled with not only finding justice for our family, but I think for the country. I think there were people that were so, disenfranchised with our legal system and so just disappointed that I think this case stood for so much more than just about getting justice for Ron and Nicole. And did you ever feel burdened by that or saddled by that?
Are you kidding me? Absolutely. I had the whole country riding on our winning this case.
Come verdict day, do you remember thinking one way or the other that when we went into that courthouse, what you thought they were going to be delivering?
I was so nervous about losing. The fear of letting you down, letting your family down, letting everybody down. I was overwhelmed with fear. I had no rational reason to think we had lost. None. But until those words were uttered, I remember just putting my head down and almost crying, and you were right behind me, and I think both of you started crying. All those years of emotion just released in one moment.
I know that the civil case represented so much to our family, but I also know from so many people it became a pathway for other victims and survivors and their families to be able to seek justice. I think you deserve a lot of credit for you taking this case.
Thank you.
I love you, and thank you for being such an advocate for my brother and for my dad and I and our family. Thank you very much.
It was certainly a life-changing experience for me. Thank you.
Kim, I wanted to ask you about Simpson's behavior in the courtroom. I mean, Dan talked about not having Simpson leaving and going back to his cell. I mean, he just went home. He's walking around. Everybody's in the same space. What was he like? For the days that he was there, because he didn't always come, he was like the mayor of the courtroom, trying to ingratiate himself to the reporters and the people that were in the room. But it wasn't until usually the end of the day's testimony that he and I would connect. I would do him the same thing I did in the criminal case, which is just stare at him as he would walk out. And we locked eyes one time and it erupted. Well, how are people treating Simpson outside the courtroom?
I heard people booing and screaming at him, but there weren't hordes of people at the trial every day like there was at the criminal case. There was one guy that used to stand out there and just scream, "Murderer, murderer," every single day and taunt him. It was sort of awesome.
But weren't there also people who showed up and wanted his autograph?
In the hotel, there would be people that would stand around the lobby, and when they'd see him, they'd ask for his autograph and take pictures. And then outside the courtroom, yes, it just wasn't throngs of people, but the people that were there were absolutely enamored with him for sure.
How was he on the stand?
Nervous. I think he started out a little cocky. And then when Dan Petrocelli started to question him, he started to get nervous because he was caught in all of his lies and he wasn't able to get away with his normal BS that he could when he wasn't being challenged. He sort of started to shrivel under pressure.
All right, let's talk about Pablo, the author.
Yes, the ghostwriter for If I Did It.
Why is he in this episode?
Pablo was an interesting character. He was one of the key witnesses in the criminal case because he established a timeline. But Pablo became more relevant to our family later on in around 2007 because he was the ghostwriter for the If I Did It book, which is important to the civil judgment that we were awarded through Dan Petrocelli's efforts. And all these years later, our lives would be entwined once again.
Hello.
Hey, Pablo. Thanks for giving me your time today.
I'm here to answer your questions.
So can you remind people how you became involved with me and my family?
Well, I lived on the Gretna Green Way, which was, very near the site of the murders. And on the night of the murders, I heard a dog's wailing. And at the time I was married and I was going to go out to investigate, but my wife decided she didn't want to be alone in the house, so I didn't go. And the next morning, detectives came around asking questions, and they asked me if I had heard anything. I said, yes, I heard a dog, and I pinpointed more or less the time that I had heard the dog.
Yeah.
So I ended up testifying at the trial for the prosecution.
During the trial, Pablo Finvez testified that he heard a dog's plaintive wail between 10:15 and 10:20 p.m. on the night of the murders.
Was there something unusual about that dog barking that drew your attention to it?
It was fairly persistent. It was at a significant pitch, and as you may recall, I described it at the time as a plaintive wail. It sounded like a, very unhappy animal.
That phrase, plaintive wail, became well known. Prosecutors believed the barking and howling came from Nicole's Akita Cato, who left bloody paw prints near the bodies. The timeline established by Pablo Finvez became crucial. The dog's wail indicated that he found the bodies before anyone else.
I established a timeline that made it very easy for O.J. Simpson to have committed the murders.
So how did testifying affect your life?
I'm in the film business, and I'd go to have meetings with people, and